In this lecture, I want to talk about the oversmoothing and oversquashing problems. The observation here is that the more layers we add, often the worse performance we get when we're talking about GNNs. But paradoxically, we need more layers if we need to capture long-range information for our problem. And this first reference here talks about the problem radii, which essentially is the distance away from the node that contains the information you need to solve the task. But we have this issue where for every layer we add, we're increasing the receptive field exponentially because we're getting the neighbors of the neighbors of the neighbors. And that is essentially just a lot of information to capture. You can imagine if there's meaningful information in this node, it's going to have to come through in the population of all these other nodes. But we know that vectors can only contain so much information. We can, of course, get explicit about this if we have 32-bit floats and we have d of them in this d-dimensional vector. We know that a single 32-bit float can represent 32 bits of information, which you could expand into a binary vector of 32 digits. Or we can basically say the number of states we can capture is 2 to the 32nd time d power. And that's an upper bound on the amount of information this vector can hold, or the number of structures it could possibly distinguish among. Any more than that and we'll start getting collisions. The capacity needed to fit the training data of this toy problem that they introduced was measured both empirically by changing the vector size and waiting until they could fit this training data, and then estimated with this upper bound approach here. And what they saw, because they could control here the radius of where the information was, essentially they've made it a memorization problem where you had to memorize the state of the node that was a certain number of hops away. And what they saw was empirically you needed a much larger vector to capture it than the theoretical bound. For example, at a radius of 6, theoretically we only need an 8-dimension vector, but in practice they needed 256. And when you go to the next problem radius, you have this exponential increase, or a doubling in this case. So it went from 8 to 19, but empirically it was 256 all the way up to 512. They went on to further demonstrate this problem on real data sets. And the way they went about this was at the very last GNN layer, instead of using the actual graph structure, the adjacency matrix, they made a fully connected adjacency matrix, which essentially allowed every node to exchange messages with every other node in the graph. And that consistently improved performance. And what that tells us is that the GNN that was using just the regular graph structure was somehow not able to get efficiently this information from far away. And by enabling them to just directly send messages anywhere they wanted, we could get lift, meaning that there was this information that they couldn't get that they were now able to get. However, if they threw away the graph structure entirely and just used these fully connected adjacencies, then they got much worse results. So this shows us that the GNNs are doing something, and it's probably short-range local information that's very important for getting us most of the way there, but it struggles with this long-range information. Here are the experimental results. We see on the left part of the column, this is the baseline. Here they add this fully connected adjacency, and then they do this across different model architectures and for different tasks in this data set. And basically you see consistent improvement. This helps almost all of the time. There is a subtle distinction between oversmoothing and oversquashing. In oversmoothing, this is when the representations of all the different nodes become indistinguishable from one another as a result of applying aggregates on top of aggregates, so averages of averages of averages, which eventually turn into this one big homogeneous blob. Oversquashing is different in that you're essentially trying to cram information from this exponentially growing receptive field into this fixed length vector that represent the nodes. And it's somewhat similar to RNNs, where you have this, say, sequence of words, and each one is feeding in through this hidden state that's being updated, and then at the end to your final token in your sequence, you have this same length of vector that's supposed to represent all the information in that sequence. And this kind of increases linearly with the sequence length. But in the case of GNNs, our problem is much worse because our receptive field increases exponentially. That's the problem, but how do we solve it? Well, one idea is to use skip connections. And the point here is that you want to copy and paste information from a lower level so that the new layer doesn't have to keep track of everything. Instead of having to remember what happened at the lower level and figure out what's happening at the current level and pass that along, you can just throw the current stuff in, worry about what's going on now, and then pass all that together to the next layer. There are a number of different ways you can arrange this. For example, in residual connections, you just can connect the previous layer to the current layer using some function, whether that's concatenation or sum, but you're just connecting the previous one to the current one. There's something called initial connection, and that is just going to connect the input features to all of the layers through the GNN. So this way they always have access to the raw features in addition to the result of the message passing. And in dense skip connection, it's essentially the same, but they have access to all of the layers that occurred before them. It would be not just the initial connection, but the initial and every other layer that came downstream. And then jumping knowledge connection is somewhat similar. It's sort of like the dense skip connection, but if it were only at the very last layer. So the last layer has access to every layer previous to it, but all of the layers in the middle of the GNN are just normal. They don't have any skip level information. Graph normalization is another approach. This is targeted towards over-smoothing, and the idea is that they want to rescale the node embeddings to make sure that they maintain a distance apart from one another. They don't all become the same thing, in other words. And there's a number of ways to do that. Batch norm is going to normalize the embeddings based on statistics of the given mini-batch. This is very common in regular deep learning, not graph-based deep learning. There's something called pair norm, where this is specific to graphs, and they're trying to maintain a consistent pairwise distance among all the nodes. Node norm is normalizing each node separately based on the variation of its features. So this has a separate learnable parameter for each node in the graph. And there's a reference here that I give at the end that has a few more of these if you want to have additional examples. Another approach is graph rewiring. And the idea here is that you want to actually change the edges that you have to make it more message passing friendly, because there's nothing that guarantees that the natural graph structure of your data is the one that's optimal for solving the task at hand, especially if you're limiting it to this message passing paradigm. And we also know that there are noisy edges, and that some important relationships between nodes are not captured necessarily by an edge. For example, in molecules, there might be really important information several bonds away, and although these two atoms in the molecule don't share a bond, they share a relationship that's important. There are a few different approaches for doing this. One is based on diffusion, where they smooth the adjacency matrix using a diffusion process, which will ultimately end up with a matrix that has weights between nodes that represent something about their similarity, and then they can sparsify that and get a new adjacency matrix that essentially will eliminate what they think are these noisy edges and end up with something where perhaps things that have a strong relationship with one another now have an edge. Another approach is using the Ricci curvature, which is this geometric concept that is, in essence, removing edges that bridge different communities, because this is what's giving this exponential increase in the receptive field. You can imagine if you have two tightly knit clusters, and you could represent that information if you're just looking at one cluster with some certain size vector. But then if you include an edge to this other cluster, now you have to represent all of the information in that one as well. So if you can selectively remove those edges and confine your information to be these tightly knit clusters, then you're not going to have this hugely increasing receptive field. I have references to the various methods presented here, but the main paper that we talked about was this on the bottleneck of graph neural networks and its practical implications. These are the tables and experiments that were mostly presented. So have a look at that if you want to dive deeper.